Chapter 22 is not split into two PowerPoints. It's just one because it's a relatively normal length chapter. Um, Once it was clear in the late 19 teens and the early 1920s after World War I that progressivism was waning, conservatism began to really take hold. Uh, there, there was a discernible downturn in radicalism and a decline in organized labor and in the progressive movement during and after World War One. The war, of course, had a lot to do with that and the U.S. involvement in the war in the last year or so of the war. Uh, the socialist movement in California was also a casualty of this downturn in radicalism and more toward a turn more toward conservative politics. It's an interesting study, this socialist movement in California. Uh, in the 1880s, clearly the leader of the socialist movement in California, indeed specifically Southern California, was on the part of the eccentric millionaire H. Gaylord Wilshire. Yes, if you've been to LA, yes, that's the Wilshire I'm talking about. He was a socialist, but he was born in a capitalist family in Ohio. His dad was a very successful businessman, and Wilshire got into oil and a bunch of other industries when he got to LA, and he got into real estate especially. He developed the part of LA which now has the street that bears his name, Wilshire Boulevard. Um, Eventually, the leadership of the California Socialists passed to a guy named Job Harriman, who was from Indiana. He came west for his health primarily. During the 19 teens, the labor unions in Los Angeles became tilted quite a bit toward socialism because of the rather vitriolic tactics of Harrison Gray Otis. You remember him, the owner of the LA Times. Harriman actually narrowly lost the mayoral election in Los Angeles twice, in 1911 and again in 1913. Um, Not satisfied with the arena of elective politics, he actually founded a kind of a commune, I guess you could call it, a cooperative community called Llano del Rio, the plain of the river in the Mojave Desert. It's a little wide spot on the road of State Route 138 east of Lancaster. You can actually see it, the ruins of it. It's certainly not there anymore. The community failed, and when it did, Harriman actually moved to Louisiana, tried to start another one, and it didn't do so well either. Here you have some images. There's an image from KCRW, which is the uh, I think it's the public television station in LA, the PBS affiliate, of H. Gaylord Wilshire. Over on the right, there's an image from the LA Times Magazine of Job Harriman, and then an image from a little online newspaper in the mountains, in the San Gabriel Mountains, in Wrightwood, California, a picture of the ruins of Llano del Rio colony, which again are on State Route 138, a few miles east of Lancaster, out in the Mojave Desert. In Northern California, J. Stitt Wilson was the Socialist Party candidate for the governor of California. He was actually from Berkeley. He was a Methodist minister. He lost the election in 1910, but he was elected to the mayor of Berkeley, that office, a year later in 1911. The elected socialists had an agenda that was really quite similar to liberal progressives. It was honestly very hard to distinguish between the two. The elected socialists were not the wild-eyed radicals like, the Wobblies and some of the other radical groups. They were, in some respects, really quite mainstream. But difficult to distinguish from the more liberal progressives or Democrat progressives. The conservatives then were able to be strategic and lump together the progressive and socialist movements and any measures that they tried to pass and denounce them as creeping socialism. When the Socialist Party, as an institution, opposed American intervention in World War I, it lost a lot of membership because there were people who were members of the Socialist Party who were certainly approving of America's intervention in World War I. So that sort of sealed the fate of the socialists. They pretty much crumbled after that. Here's an interesting case which came up in the mid to late 19 teens, the case of Thomas J. Mooney. The people who were more on the conservative side of the ledger and who were trying to prepare America's industries for and people for our eventual involvement in World War I, held what was called a Preparedness Day parade in San Francisco on July 22nd, 1916. The parade was bombed, and there were people killed in that bombing. Tom Mooney, who was a well-known labor agitator at the time, was suspected of being the one who perpetrated this bombing. A friend of his who also knew something about explosives, Warren Billings, was also suspected in this bombing of the Preparedness Day parade in San Francisco on July 22nd, 1916. A short time after the bombing, a few days later, both were arrested and charged. But you know, there historians say that there was no evidence that was really presented, no real evidence against these men. They were arrested without warrants or formal charges, and that history suggests that the evidence was strongly fabricated. It's interesting because back in 1910, when the LA Times was bombed, people did not want to believe that the McNamara brothers, labor activists, were involved in it when they actually were. And here, this guy Mooney and this guy Billings had trumped up evidence against them, but people who were very, very willing and ready and able to believe the trumped up evidence. It was quite the reverse. Billings was convicted and sentenced to life. Mooney was convicted and sentenced to hang until he was dead. Mooney's sentence, however, was commuted by Governor Stevens in November of 1918 to life in prison. A law was passed in the late 19 teens in California called a criminal syndicalism law, the criminal syndicalism law. There was a great anti-radicalism sentiment after World War I, when the full force of public hatred was turned upon so-called internal enemies, meaning that the law was designed to prohibit any organization or anybody that essentially threatened the power of the government. There were many, many people who were actually arrested and tried the first 5 years that this law had been implemented in the late 19 teens and the early 1920s. One of the more famous trials was that of Charlotte Anita Whitney, who was actually a philanthropist in California. She was convicted under this law and sentenced to prison for 1 to 14 years. So she was in her mid-50s at this point and was actually convicted of this law because she went to a socialist gathering at one point in her, involvement in different groups. She appealed. Her attorney on appeal was John Francis Nayland. He was a pretty sharp attorney in San Francisco. He disagreed with Whitney's political views, but still believed that she had the right to express them without being arrested or convicted for doing so. The case ultimately went to the U.S. Supreme Court in May of 1927. Her conviction and the law were both upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, but while Nayland was unsuccessful in appealing Whitney's conviction, he was successful in fighting for a pardon, and Governor Clement C. Young granted a pardon to Whitney 1 month later. And it wasn't until 1968 that the U.S. Supreme Court declared that this law was actually unconstitutional. Very interesting. Here you see an image of Charlotte Whitney on the right and John Nayland on the left. This is courtesy of the Bancroft Library, and this is an image that is also in your textbook. Democratic Party voter registration declined precipitously, especially after the 19 teens, but began in the early 1900s after a long series of defeats. There was a time when Democrat and Republican voter registration prior to 1900 was actually pretty even Steven, so to speak. But by the 1920s and through the 1920s, California Republicans outnumbered Democrats by 4 to 1 in voter registration after basically being neck and neck before 1900. What didn't help the Democrats also is that they had relatively weak leadership in California in the 1920s. And remember, this conservative republicanism was all part of, the Roaring Twenties, and there was this tremendous growth in the stock market and all of this incredible prosperity that was going on during this particular time. Prohibition was a major issue, which really kind of confused the alignments of progressive and conservative Republicans as well as the Democrats. So basically, you had many California progressives who were considered to be dries. Conservative Republicans and Democrats were often in the wet category. So you had the dries and the wets, and oftentimes that was a delineation between how people voted and how they felt about certain laws that were being passed. Um, there was a blatant disregard of prohibition, meaning the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Enforcement was focused on small cafes, but basically ignored the big distilleries and the big bootleggers in California. So there was a great deal of disparity in that enforcement of prohibition. Remember the National Origins Quota Act of 1924 that Hiram Johnson was involved in? We mentioned that earlier. This continued to intensify the discrimination against the Japanese during the 1920s. This had unexpected consequences, though, of increasing Filipino immigration. Now, this is interesting because the Philippines were a U.S. possession, so Filipinos were not subject to any kind of exclusion laws that had been passed against any groups. They could immigrate. They were technically Americans. Um, there was a fellow by the name of Friend Richardson who won the governor's race in 1922. He was a conservative who replaced the heads of many of the progressive commissions that were established during Hiram Johnson's time. The progressives, however, were successful in electing their candidate, Clement C. Young, to the governorship in 1926. But if not for the help of a fellow by the name A.P. Giannini, of Bank of Italy fame, later to be known as Bank of America, it's possible that Clement C. Young would not have won the governorship. The progressives were a little bit taken aback that Young accepted Giannini's backing. But then, of course, once Young got into office, they sort of eliminated many of the laws that prohibited the expansion of branch banking. And that was really the interesting notoriety and innovation of the Bank of America, as you know, if you know their history, which started in San Francisco as the Bank of Italy. They invented essentially branch banking as we know it today. So there is the story of um, uh, the governorships in the 1920s. And now we talk about apportionment. What this means is, how are the districts drawn for the California Senate and the California Assembly, the two houses of our government? Prior to 1926, the apportionment of the districts for those two bodies in the legislature was based strictly on population. Now, since the South was growing faster than the North was afraid of losing clout. So on the 1926 ballot, there were two plans for voters to choose from. There was something called the All Parties Proposal, also known as the Los Angeles Plan, that left apportionment just the way it was, based on population for both the California Senate and the California Assembly. Then there was the so-called federal plan, which was pushed a lot by people in San Francisco, which apportioned state Senate seats at not more than one to a county and at not more than 3 counties to a senatorial district. It left the apportionment in the Assembly alone by population. It was the so-called federal plan that was approved by the majority of voters in 1926, therefore, to a certain extent, securing the clout of the northern part of California in California politics. That is the PowerPoint narrated for Chapter 22.